Hi, I am Jennifer Purcell, and welcome to my podcast, Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge, where we will discuss, discover, and learn more about the challenges and triumphs of those with NLD and other learning challenges. I do have a website for this podcast, and it is called livingwithnld.com. I also have a Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter account for the podcast. They are all under the same name, which is Living with NLD. I also have a YouTube channel for the podcast, which can be found by Googling the title of the podcast, which is Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge. I would like to tell you about a nonprofit that I use for my research for this podcast. It is called the NVLD Project, and I use their blog for my research. They are a nonprofit that is based in New York and is trying to get NVLD back on the DSM, and they provide many resources for people with NVLD on their website. I'll provide you with the website for them in the podcast description. All proceeds from the ads on this podcast will be donated towards the NVLD project. Please feel free to explore the other topics on the podcast, and hopefully you will learn something new from them. I hope you enjoyed today's episodes. All right, good morning or maybe good afternoon, depending on where you're listening from. And I'm Jennifer Purcell. I'm here today with Tara, and I will be interviewing her on her work with Arrowsmith and Barbara, and on her article about learning disabilities, dispelling common myths. So I'll have her start by introducing herself.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. My name is Tara Bonner, and I am an educator by training, by experience. I spent many years in traditional classrooms and traditional special education classrooms for the first part of my career. But for the last 15, I haven't done the math recently, it's probably more than that, I have been supporting individuals and families and organizations access neuroplastic programs. So these are programs designed to create structural and functional changes in the brain and really transform how people learn and navigate the world. So, Jennifer, I really appreciate this time that we have together, and I've come to learn a little bit about your work and experience. And I think we'll have a lot to chat about today. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for letting me allowing me to have you too. I appreciate that, and I'm looking forward to it as well. Um, so the first question is, what are some of the most common myths about learning disabilities, and how does the article dispel them?
For sure. So, by the way, I would love, Jennifer, for you to share the article at some point with your audience. And
Of course.
my organization and our work, we think it's really important to be constantly sharing information and awareness for people to learn about the fields of neuroplasticity, to learn about the field of learning and even of learning difficulty. So there's lots of information on our website. And the article that you describe, I think, is a really important one because I think these days, more than ever, there's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of assumptions out there based on information and sometimes misinformation. All of this to
Mhm.
say, when we're talking and learning and understanding about learning difficulties, whether it be a diagnosed learning difficulty like nonverbal learning disability or dyslexia, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions and myths out there. So I'd like to look at really what I see as the two most important myths or
Mhm.
misconceptions to dispel. And the reason I think they're the most important is because they tend to be incredibly damaging and they're
Mm.
also scientifically inaccurate. So the first being that people with learning disabilities are not smart. Okay, this is really, really wrong. Learning disabilities has nothing to do with intelligence. In fact, the definition of having a learning disability is that an individual scores at least within the average range of intelligence measures, like IQ scores, for example. And
Mm-hmm.
many people with learning disabilities score well above average in several of those measures. So that's the first really, really quickly myth to dispel is people with learning difficulties are intelligent. They are smart. They are bright. And I know your audience already knows that. And I just want them to remember that and for that to be reinforced in every fiber of their being. What's also inaccurate and a really important myth to dispel is that the struggles related to learning disabilities are permanent, are lifelong. This is not true in research and it's not true in experience. It is possible to address the underlying causes of learning disabilities and no longer struggle or at least change the reality or experience of features or symptoms of learning disabilities. So those for me are the two most important. I think related to that is this myth that children will grow out of learning difficulties or disabilities,
Mm-hmm.
or that they're just, I don't know, late bloomers. And not only is this inaccurate, but it can be dangerous. It can lead to a misunderstanding or a misconception of the behaviors that typically come with learning difficulties. So I think, yeah, I think those are really critical pieces of awareness that need to be shifted, and hopefully why we're talking today is that shift in conversation.
Yeah, I agree with you. Those are three important myths. And I remember a previous episode I did on myths and facts of NLD. And
Mhm.
those were actually some of them in terms of, like you were saying, the intelligence and the um, not it being permanent and the fact that a child might not grow out of it. And I think for me, I've realized through myself that um, ever since I was diagnosed in college and when I was 19 with nonverbal learning disability,
Mhm.
that I think I mean, I knew I was smart because of how well I did in school, but I also
Right.
knew that I had other smarts like street smarts and, you know, some people's skills. But then when I got my diagnosis, I was like, oh, okay, like a light bulb went off for me and being able to know more about myself and realize, okay, this is why some things are challenging, but I can work on those challenges and make it easier, like you were saying about, um, it's not permanent, it's fluid. You can make it easier to some extent, depending on what those things are.
Absolutely. And thank you, Jennifer, for reminding me of another misconception. And I don't think it's in that
Mm-hmm.
article. And it's that learning difficulties or disabilities only affect school life or academic learning. And I think that does lead to, first of all, it's, maybe lower on the scale of damaging,
Mm-hmm.
but it actually can be for the individual themselves because they tend to uh, assume that difficulties or realities, experiences that they're having outside of school, well, that must be something else. Or
Mm-hmm.
even parents who they recognize and really they even uh, honor and support their child with their school struggles, and yet those same struggles or the same causes of those struggles impact home life or communication with siblings or how they may be behaving in the bus or in the restaurant, and suddenly it's a something else. It's, they're naughty or they're rude or they're arrogant, or
Mm.
it's interpreted as something else. So that tendency that learning difficulties or disabilities are a school problem, or a school impacts school more than any other aspect of learning is wrong, is risky for sure.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I know for me when I graduated from college about 6 years ago, I was more understanding of that myth, because then I was able to, okay, I can look back as I was starting to work and compare my challenges in the working field to college. I'm like, okay, some of them are the same because I'm still interacting with people.
Mhm.
Yes, it's a different setting, but you still have the social setting in general of interacting with people. And for me, I one of the challenges I worked on, and you probably come across this in your work, is in reading body language and facial expressions and tone of
Mhm.
voice. And um, I've become better at that through reading books or working with my friends or my family on that. And one of the ways I did that was um, a simple way. I would, like, when I was watching my favorite TV program, I would occasionally mute it and be like, okay, can I tell without the audio what the body language means?
Wow, good for you. What a great
Thanks.
tactic.
It was challenging though, because it's like, okay, well, now I don't have audio to help me, right? So, but it was fun because I like challenging things. I like to challenge my brain. Um, and so being able to see, okay, could I get it right or close to right? Um, and it was kind of like a game for me.
That's amazing, Jennifer. I mean, we'll come to this topic, or maybe we're already there, which is what's happening in our brains when we learn,
Hmm.
and frankly, what's happening in our brains when we struggle to learn, because that is where learning takes place, our brains. That is where, therefore, learning struggles take place, is our brain. And what you've just described really beautifully are very specific cognitive functions. Cognitive functions are essentially the regions of the brain, or networks in the brain, that are responsible for really specific jobs or tasks in learning. And there's part of our brain, prefrontal lobe in our right hemisphere, and it's responsible for perceiving and interpreting our nonverbal world, exactly what you just
Mm.
described. So even if there's just a mild weakness there, it's going to be harder for us. Absolutely. It's going to be not impossible, but it's going to take more time and more energy. And that's really, if we want to look at what's the operational definition of a learning disability, or difficulty, and even if we want to understand what's our brain's role in learning, and what's our brain's role in difficulty learning, it's these cognitive functions. It's these parts of our brain that are responsible for certain tasks, or they play a role, together in these tasks. And we all have these cognitive functions, and we all have some degree of functioning in these cognitive functions. And all of us will have strengths to some degree in certain cognitive functions, and difficulties to some degree in certain cognitive functions. And those difficulties don't make learning impossible, at least for the most part, but harder for sure, and more
Hmm.
challenging. And we have to be incredibly conscious and explicit of learning when those particular cognitive functions are being kind of asked to be involved. There's a neat study, I'll share it with you if you're interested. Now, this wasn't
Yeah.
about NVLD, it was about dyslexia. But these researchers at the University of Washington, they were they basically observed the brains of individuals doing a reading task. And they had a group of individuals with dyslexic diagnosis, a diagnosis of dyslexia, and they had those without a diagnosis of dyslexia. And they observed their brains while they were reading. Now, was it that
Mm.
people with dyslexia weren't reading? No. What was happening in their brains, that their brains were actually working much harder. It was 4.6 times harder. They had a
Wow.
complex way of measuring brain activity and brain energy. And those with dyslexia were working 5 times harder than those without dyslexia. So it wasn't that their brains were not active. In fact, they were overactive. So when you describe your experience, it wasn't that your brain was just kind of sitting back saying, I'm not interested, I can't be bothered, like this willful intention of, oh, I just don't want to know how people are feeling or thinking. Not at all. It's that there's a cognitive function responsible for that kind of task. And when it's under functioning, that learning experience is going to be hard. It's not, this goes back to that misconception, right? Is it laziness? Is it lack of effort? Absolutely not. In fact, typically the brain is working even harder in those cases. So talk about dispelling a myth, or what's the harm in misunderstanding? I mean, it's wrong. So that's why it's important to make sure that we are understanding others and ourselves with more clarity and more accuracy, because it can be harmful. We're not choosing to struggle. We're not. That's this mindset of, frankly, blaming the person. It's in a way, it's a misdiagnosis. Like those features are due to personality flaws.
Yeah.
Or character issues, like they're willfully trying to fail, or that we're trying to avoid success. And what's really harmful about that, Jennifer, and I love that you've had in many ways an incredibly positive experience, probably because of your internal strength, probably because the world with which you have the people and places that you've surrounded yourself with. But you probably can relate to the fact, or at least to the risk, and I know your audience can, of the harm of misunderstanding or assuming someone is willfully trying to kind of mess up, because people start to believe it, right? We start to internalize when we are called lazy, or for children who are seen to be misbehaving or avoiding tasks. When we hear it again and again and again, we start to believe it, and it can be really damaging to our self-concept, to our belief in ourselves, and to what we believe we're capable of. And again, there's research on this. It shows, certainly statistically, people with learning disabilities, particularly if they're misdiagnosed or not diagnosed, they tend to struggle in adulthood, and sometimes really devastating and dangerous choices that they ultimately are making: substance abuse, poor quality of life, poor health. And I think it's because they've misunderstood themselves, because the world has misunderstood them. And so I think it happens a lot. And I think that tendency, that self-fulfilling prophecy, is why I'm grateful, really, Jennifer, that you're doing the work you're doing, that you've created a place and a space and a community where people are not being defined or defining themselves by what they can't do, because it doesn't have to be that way. And and it's wrong. It's a misconception. It's a myth to be busted.
Yes, thank you for saying that. You actually reminded me of when you were sharing that study about dyslexia. Um, when I started this podcast, one of the things I discovered about myself, I don't know, this is part of NLD or maybe a little bit of dyslexia that I might have, but whenever I create a podcast script or I create questions for an interview, I tend to underline them sometimes, because if they're not short sentences, I will kind of jump lines when I'm reading them.
Sure.
And I realized, oh, that's, similar to dyslexia. And I'm like, Okay, well, that makes sense to me because now I know why when I used to read a physical book before I knew audiobooks were easier for me, I would get tired and I would kind of get a headache sometimes and I would be lethargic afterwards. I'm like, I wouldn't really enjoy it and I would forget what I had read. I wouldn't retain it very well. But then when I went to college and got my diagnosis and realized, oh, my audio memory is my best memory. So audio is better for me to receive and retain material. And so I started doing it purely with audiobooks for school. And um, I mean, that was amazing to me to because before then my grades in college were just C's, and then after I had my accommodations, they were A's and B's.
Amazing.
So
Amazing.
yeah, you could see how much that helped,
I would argue, I agree with you, Jennifer, and I would argue it's the first, as you say, there's the identifying it and then there's the accommodation.
Mhm.
In my view, it's the first piece that has, in a way, a more profound
Mm,
shift in your understanding of yourself and again,
mhm.
of perhaps even how others perceive you. It's that awareness, it's that accurate understanding that it's not, you weren't, when you're that's a classic, really a classic feature of someone, what we call motor symbol sequencing. It's the part of our brain, and it's not, honestly, it's kind of a mechanical aspect of our brain. It's not really a higher order brain function thinking about problem solving and
Mm,
organization. It sounds like you have strengths in those functions, but it's the part of our brain that learns our motor plans when we write, when we type, or when our eyes track across a page. Okay.
mm,
So if our
okay.
eye is missing a word, losing its place, coming to the end of the line and, not smoothly getting to the next line on that page, then of course it's going to feel exhausting, and it's probably going to
Mhm.
feel a little bit annoying. And hopefully we'll come up with strategy. If we have a strength in strategy creation and executive function, those are other cognitive areas.
Of course.
But that again, motor symbol sequencing, that eye tracking, it can have a massive impact on how we engage with the written word, and it can be, as you say, exhausting. And I think so
Mhm.
many people, particularly in school, when kids are learning how to read, and they talk about feeling tired, feeling taxed at the end uh, of a piece of text, or even just a couple of lines, and they're kind of dismissed as like, oh, they're just avoiding the task, or maybe there's a bigger issue at hand, maybe they're sleep deprived, maybe there's
They're
attention
lazy.
issues, there's this misunderstanding or misdiagnosis, when actually it's just a very specific and frankly very addressable cognitive function that's responsible for our eye tracking, and some great strategies in the meantime, as you've described. And also, once we understand what's going on there, we can actually create programming to change that reality. So I love, Jennifer, that you've already been identifying kind of different cognitive function. My role here very easy, because that's definitely something I'd love for your audience to start exploring kind of in their own minds, is what does this mean? The more we understand how our brains are operating,
Mhm.
I think we'll see ourselves differently. We'll see others differently, and we may make different decisions about how we want to move through the world. And we'll definitely treat each other with more compassion or understanding or patience when we understand that there's a cognitive function at play. I mean, even listening to this podcast, your audience their brains are working really hard.
Right.
They're having to pay attention to what you and I are saying and not get distracted by, you know, the dog or the TV, or they're making a decision about what they need to pay attention to.
Mhm.
If they hear a crash, are they going to keep listening to us, or are they going to go find out what's going on in the kitchen? So there's attention
Absolutely.
at play here. They have to understand what we're saying, They have to understand the
Mm-hmm.
words and the phrases. They have to remember what we've said, the details of what we're saying. They have to kind of process what we're saying, like make connections, even make connections between what I'm saying and what you're saying. They have to kind of think critically about what might be two different points of view or two different concepts, and they have to synthesize that and analyze that. And because this is audio, they have to pick up on cues and clues, as you say, that aren't necessarily right in front of them, but maybe our
Mm-hmm.
tones of voice, the pauses in between our words, all of those nonverbal cues and clues. That's another cognitive function. So just in this last, 20 seconds, your listeners have been using no less than 6, 10 different cognitive functions. And that's the more we understand that interplay, I think it can be really powerful in understanding, as I said, ourselves and others in the world.
Yeah, I think you're right with that. And I think this would be a good time for the second question in terms of, because we were getting at this topic of you, and you mentioned this a little bit, but of how the article or how you define learning
Mm.
disabilities. And we were also talking about what distinguishes them, I think, from intellectual disabilities or lack of
Mm.
effort. We were definitely
Mm-hmm.
talking about lack of effort.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope that we've dispelled that.
Mm-hmm.
Someone with someone with a diagnosis, but even anyone who struggles with some degree of learning or experiences some interference in their learning has nothing to do with their intelligence and simply to do with a specific or combination of cognitive functions that are underperforming. So that's really uh, something that I think may be new to some of your audience. I think we all know that the brain is kind of our, you know, our it's at the heart of every action and reaction that we do. What might be new to some of your listeners is the makeup of our brains. That
Mm-hmm.
it's not the case that there's, like a math part of our brain, a reading part of our brain, even like a memory part of our brain, that our brains are made up of these discrete cognitive functions. And these cognitive functions have a really specific role in anything we do: reading, writing, riding a bike, following a recipe, following a podcast, managing a project, making a friend. All of these things require these cognitive functions to be working together. And and each cognitive function, you can kind of measure it. You can actually see if it's a source of strength, if it's a source of weakness, or somewhere in between. So we all have these cognitive functions operating somewhere along that continuum, and that makeup, that design is unique to each of us. So we all have a unique cognitive profile. We all have a unique brain, as unique as our fingerprints, as unique as snowflakes. And those cognitive functions, for those of us, for all of us, as I said, they're operating on some degree of strength. And a learning disability effectively is one or some of those cognitive functions under operating or underperforming to some degree. Even a mild degree may be leading or causing a learning disability or learning difficulty. So really, these cognitive functions are the root of our learning and therefore the root of our learning difficulty.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. And actually, it makes me think of how I kind of came up with the term learning challenge, uh,
Uh-huh.
part of the title of the podcast, because when I was trying to think of the name for the podcast, I was like, well, I don't really like disability because I don't feel disabled, right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So I was like, well, I know I like to challenge myself, like I was talking about earlier. So I was like, well, I'll say, well, I'll kind of create that I'm living with something that's invisible, right?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
know it's about learning. So that's kind of how I came up living with invisible learning challenge. And even though the name is long, I think it compels what it needs to compel for the podcast. And it's easy because you can apply it to any diagnosis in the neurodiverse field.
Absolutely.
So I like that.
Jennifer, I think again, I think this is why we're talking today and why we have a lot in common, because what we're talking about is the value and risks of labels, of what's in a word, as Shakespeare said. I think it was Shakespeare. And honestly, personally, and even professionally, sometimes I'm in two minds about the value and the risk of a label. Because certainly in conventional education and professional and even social settings, it can be incredibly important to have a label or a diagnosis in order, you mentioned them, in order to get certain supports or accommodations or modifications. And it should be an individual's absolute right, human right, to have access to tools and strategies that allow them to express their intelligence, to express themselves, and to be seen and heard as they deserve.
Hopefully what you can do with these episodes on this podcast, Living with Invisible Learning Challenge, I would like to challenge you to journal about the episodes and just see what you learn from them. Or you can share about the episodes with your friends and family and see what they can learn from them. And as always, I will post the links to the articles that I use in the description of the podcast. And please let me know if you know somebody who you think would want to be interviewed on this podcast, or if you yourself would want to be interviewed. Please email me. I have my email on my website, and I also have it pretty much pretty accessible on Facebook and Instagram through messaging as well. So you can get in contact with me in those ways.